welcome now. We're going to have the next 10 fellows talk. And I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Stephen Tong from the University of Melbourne. Thank you.
Thank you. So pregnancy can be a treacherous moment for mum and unborn baby. Every year, the world loses 300,000 pregnant women. And for the baby, the risk of dying on her day of birth is so high, she'll never face the same daily risk again until age 92. So my research seeks to improve clinical care, sorting out what's safe today and finding better ways for tomorrow. On sorting out what's safe today, we're using big data from many countries to define the health impacts, if any, of critical decisions made during pregnancy. Whether opting for an epidural or consuming certain medicines causes learning difficulties in the child. Whether taking aspirin increases the risk of dangerous bleeding. And many of our discoveries have changed clinical guidelines, empowering women to make better choices based on evidence. On finding better ways for tomorrow, we're chasing a blood test of placental health. Blood tests to check on the health of the kidneys, the liver and the thyroid are ubiquitous, but no such test exists for the placenta. And with funds raised from nearly every NHMRC scheme imaginable, my team has been doggedly chasing a placental health test. And we think we are close. And we've discovered a blood test that picks out pregnancies where the placenta is ailing fast and the baby is at 10-fold increased risk of stillbirth. And we're soon to walk the final steps of translation. I'm also on the hunt for a drug to treat preeclampsia, and this horrid pregnancy condition imperils the life of both the mum and the baby. And known about for 2 millennia, unlike a lot of the diseases that you guys study, there's not a single disease-modifying treatment. And I lead a drug discovery pipeline, screening drug candidates in the laboratory and testing the most promising ones in successive randomized trials. And we announced metformin as possibly the first disease-modifying drug for preeclampsia. And I'm now leading a global network of randomized trials, all harmonized to validate this exciting breakthrough. And to end, my lifelong career goal is to work with mentees, to grow them, to grow with them, to make impactful discoveries that brings more mums and babies safely home. So I thank the Academy, I thank Ingrid Sheffer for kindly nominating me, and I feel incredibly privileged to join you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. As someone working in the area of obesity and insulin resistance, I sometimes think metformin should be in the water supply of the country, of our country. Another indication here. We move on to our next speaker, Professor Chris Blyth, who's from the University of Western Australia. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Louise. And similar to Kim, I am a former mentee, so a real shout out to all the mentees out there and to David particularly for his support over the last couple of years. I truly have imposter syndrome amongst all these incredible scientists making incredible discoveries. So I'm a Professor of Paediatric Infectious Diseases at the School of Medicine at UWA and head of the Wesfarmers Centre of Vaccines and Infectious Diseases, with clinical appointments at Perth Children's Hospital and with Pathwest Laboratory. My research, clinical and policy and advocacy work is really focused on optimising diagnosis, treatment and prevention of vaccine-preventable diseases, and that work has led to substantial changes in national and international immunisation policy in the setting of flu, pneumococcus and more recently COVID and RSV. I constantly need to remind myself that actually you can have the best vaccine in the world, but it doesn't work if it sits in the lab or in the fridge. And so my work is really at the other end. How do we make sure it gets into policy, and how does it get into arms? In addition to leading in generation of new knowledge on new vaccines and new vaccine schedules, my efforts has really been focused on getting vaccines onto national programs and to the programs of many low and middle income countries. I had the honour of being a member of the Australian Technical Advisory Group for over a decade and leading this group from 2018 to the end of 2021 through the first phase of COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccine program. Despite the many challenges with the COVID vaccine program rollout, I am proud that we made decisions based on the best available evidence at that time and communicated as clearly as we could to politicians, health and science leaders and the community amidst a media-fuelled frenzy. I have a passion for mentoring and training and capacity building and watching previous clinical fellows but also PhD scientists and students thrive and establish their own groups, leading national and international programs bring me incredible joy. So I'm humbled to be elected to the Academy to join this austere and very important group of people to drive changes in health from around the country. So thank you.
It's wonderful over the years to see previous mentees, now fellows, and I just think that's one of the aims of our mentorship program. So wonderful, and wonderful to see people so keen about mentorship as well. We're really keen to grow our mentorship work. David, a fellow member of the mentorship committee, is going, yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you. And we now move on to our next speaker, Professor Danny Green, who's from the University of Western Australia. We've got quite a number of Western Australians here tonight.
Chris, this morning I told my wife I had imposter syndrome and she said, don't worry, everyone's got imposter syndrome. I'm not sure that's true. To continue the theme, I'm also the first person in my family in 60,000 years to go to university. I went to a small country town in Western Australia and grew up and went to the statistically worst high school in Western Australia, Kalgoorlie Regional High School. If you haven't been to Kalgoorlie, it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. So my theme is life is what happens when you're busy making plans. In 1990, my plan was to finish my undergrad biological science degree and then apply to study medicine to do something useful. But someone mentioned honours research, so I boldly approached the Professor of Cardiology at Royal Perth Hospital, Roger Taylor, who in a state of bemusement agreed to take me on. While making that plan, I was awarded a British Council scholarship to work at St George's Hospital in London, where I learnt vascular pharmacology techniques from a young and promising clinical trainee named Patrick Vallance. You may have heard of Patrick. He became the UK chief scientist during COVID and had the most difficult job in world science, explaining immunology to Boris Johnson. They knighted him for that. Anyway, I brought the techniques I learnt back to Perth, where I set about establishing that the new blockbuster ACE inhibitor and statin drugs had direct physiological effects on the artery wall. This resulted in papers in The Lancet in Circulation, so I decided to modify my plan, maybe do a PhD before that medical degree. That plan was soon disrupted. Royal Perth Hospital had established a new cardiac transplant unit, and I was asked to do the exercise testing for end-stage heart failure patients. Knowing nothing at all about heart failure, I agreed. This led to the development of a research-intensive exercise rehab service for the transplant unit, the first of its type in the world. Our research outcomes were paradigm-shifting. Exercise-based therapy, contraindicated in the 1990s in heart failure, is now mandated. Eventually, it occurred to me that it might be a good idea, alongside limiting the end-stage heart failure effects, to prevent cardiovascular diseases. So I developed a vascular imaging software program to detect the early stages of atherosclerosis. This showed that changes in shear forces inside of arteries have direct effects on artery health that protect people from atherosclerosis. This fostered new research in cardiovascular biomechanics. Eventually, I came to realise that clinical exercise physiology actually had a supply-side problem. There were no pathways for training or registration of clinical exercise physiologists in Australia. So I helped to develop Australia's first master's degree in the field, and then established a national framework to regulate what eventually became a new allied health profession. There are now over 10,000 Medicare registered clinical exercise physiologists across Australia, and the standards I helped to develop were used in 29 university courses. I'm now helping the UK government to build this ecosystem into the NHS. So I thank you for accepting me into the Academy. I thank Anna for the nomination. Although I still haven't got around to implementing Plan A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny. We now move on to Professor James Whisstock, who's from Monash University. Thank you, James. Another James.
Hiya, and first of all, I'm so honoured to have received this fellowship, and I'd also like to thank my nominator, Professor Angel Lopez. I guess my journey to Australia began in 1997 when I moved here from foggy Cambridge. I had a really odd start here. With my, I was supposed to work with a great scientist called Professor Stuart Stone, who sadly died just before I arrived. Chris Mitchell came to Monash and has been my boss ever since. She's fantastic, and she basically said, look, just do good science. I don't care what you do, do good science. So 10 years on, we were really interested with my then wife, Michelle Dunstone, to actually understand how the immune system kills malignant cells and bacteria. And it turns out that basically immunity deploys pore-forming toxins to punch essentially large holes in cells, and that is a very effective way of killing something. And that was originally observed by Jules Bordet back in the late 19th century. So it took about 10 years, but pretty much at the same time my first child was born, my colleague Ruby Law got the final piece of data that we needed to solve that structure. I remember building the structure while covered in vomit, which was lovely. It also turns out that new stories are normally old stories, and that bacterial cytolysins, which Jamie Rossjohn and Mike Parker solved 10 years previously, actually are present in humans as well and are used to basically destroy targets. I then spent 6 months in London with the great Helen Sable, redoubtable Helen Sable, who taught me how to do electron microscopy. And when I returned, I decided that we had to have EM in Australia, high throughput electron microscopy in Australia. And I remember going to see Edwina Cornish, and I must have been in particularly good form that day because she, after about 5 minutes, she said, for God's sake, James, here's $1 million, just go away and don't F it up. With the Ramacchioti Foundation, we were able to establish the first cryo-electron microscopy unit in Australia, and that is still bearing fruit to this day. I'd like to finish off by thanking my family, Charlotte and Claire, my daughters in particular. Charlotte's about to start her journey in university, I hope. Claire seems to be very interested in what I'm doing with my car, which worries me. And my wonderful partner, Jane Lee, and her son, Mingyu, who have given me so much love and support. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, James. We now move to our next speaker, Professor Julie Simpson, who's from the University of Melbourne. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you to the Academy, and I'd like to thank John Carlin and Andrew Forbes, who encouraged me to apply. So I'm a statistician. In 1995, I was 25 years old, and I travelled to Bangkok to be their first statistician at 3 Oxford clinical research units. So it was incredible. I was statistician in Bangkok, in Ho Chi Minh City, and up on the Thai-Myanmar border. After just a couple of days of arriving, they said, right, you've got to catch this overnight bus up to this town called Masot. I arrived at 5 a.m. with this very heavy laptop. They were heavy in those days. And this Karen guy, Imale, turned up on his motorbike and said, hop on the back, I'm taking you out to the refugee camp. I arrived there, just unpacked, and one of the doctors, Dr. Rose McCready, said, come with me, I want you to see, we've got to go visit a patient with malaria. It was a 2-hour hike in the jungle. Saw snakes crossing rivers on dangerous bridges. And there we saw a pregnant woman living in a very small bamboo hut with malaria. And for me, that started a lifelong passion to work in malaria research and global health. And even though I've moved around the world, I just could not budge from that passion. After a few months in the job, Sir Nick White said to me, you're doing a great job, but I want you to lead some research. I think the parasite doesn't invade the red blood cell randomly. We give one dose on one day to every patient, but I think it probably needs to be different for children and pregnant women, but the data's sparse and we don't know how to use it. So you tell us what experiments you need, what clinical studies, and can you just fill in the dots, do something mathematical to come up with those answers? And I realised it couldn't be answered with stats alone, that I had to think about mathematical biology as well and learn the biology, sit with the lab scientists, learn all that. And I brought those two disciplines together. And then I was able to start answering questions to say, hey, we should actually give the drug over 3 days. Children with severe malaria need to be given a higher dose. And then Nick said, well, you can't just stop at the paper. I'm sending you off to Geneva to join the WHO treatment guidelines. I want you to explain it to them and get it into policy. And so that's been another motivation. Any stats or methods we do, I always think, is this actually going to answer an important question? So that's where my journey's got me. It's been amazing. It's had incredible people along the way. And I'd like to finish with two things. One thing is there's a quote, not by me, about biostatisticians. We are always on tap, but we are never on top. And the wonderful thing about our profession is we work with every one of you in the room, and that's what I love about my job every week. The second thing I'd like to finish on is I'd like to thank my mum. My mum was a laboratory scientist working in polio vaccine and loved her job. But sadly, in 1964, when she married my father, who she loves and she's still married to this day, she had to leave her job by law for a man or for an unmarried woman. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Interesting stories about families and impacts and where we come from and origins, aren't there, in all of this? We now move on to Professor James Ward from the University of Queensland. Thank you, James.
There are so many Jameses here. Let me begin by acknowledging traditional owners of this country, the Kaurna people. I, like many others, are the first in my family, my community, my extended community, and it wasn't the usual pathway, but I'm very pleased. I'm inspiring my own family and clan to do the path I have. The research that I love doing, it was a passion that started a very long time ago before research. I try and control STIs in Aboriginal communities. It started when HIV first came to Australia. We knew what catastrophe HIV could have with our population. Thankfully, we've averted HIV from taking hold in our community. And testament to that is that we're probably one of the few populations in the world where HIV is very low, but STIs, other sexually transmissible infections, are very high. One of the biggest disappointments of my life is writing a paper for the MJA in 2011, which said, wasn't the MJA paper, Ginny, it was saying now is the time to eliminate infectious syphilis. We had 129 cases in our community. It let go. Governments didn't do the right thing at the right time and at the right level of potency. And now we have more than 6,500 cases of infectious syphilis in our communities. It's here to stay. And that was despite staunch advocacy and political push for many months and years. So there's one thing I've learned over the years is that a single bullet is not the answer to Aboriginal health, and what we require is multi-level interventions. The challenge is how do we get the research funding to fund multi-level interventions, because what we're trained in is training for a single intervention and working out what we do. And I've done many single interventions over the years and they all make a little bit of an impact. What we need to do now is put them all together to make the big impact. In closing, so I love doing STIs. I'm still doggedly doing it. I'm moving towards precision public health in that space and multi-level interventions. But more importantly, how do we measure multi-level interventions in our communities? More excitingly, I'm moving towards urban Indigenous health. And why urban Indigenous health? 41% of our population live in urban populations. There's no disaggregated data at this at level for capital cities. It's the fastest growing population in Australia. 3 times less the amount of research is done in urban populations. And If we don't focus on urban Indigenous health, we're never going to close the gap. So I've got many studies underway in the urban health agenda, many partnerships underway in the urban agenda, and I look forward to that next phase of my journey. Thank you to the Academy, thank you to my family, and thank you to my community. Yep.
Thank you, James. You in particular, but every single one of our speakers is truly inspirational. Well, we're not leaving the James word undone, because the next person is Professor Paul James, surname, from Parkville Familial Cancer Centre. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Louise, but you stole my joke. I was going to say, I don't know why people are surprised there's so many Jameses. Literally everyone in my family is called James. Thank you for the honour of election to the Academy, and particularly to the people that nominated me and Professor Ingrid Winship, who was the main catalyst behind pushing me forward to this role. As you can probably tell from this outrageous accent that I'm using, that I come originally from New Zealand. I was born and raised in Rotorua and Te Arawa lands, and I live now near the banks of the Yarra in Wurundjeri country, where I am the lead of the Parkville Familial Cancer Centre at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre and the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and the leader of the clinical genetics program at Royal Melbourne Hospital. I was captured by genomics very early in life when I fully understood that a lot of the answers to the most important questions about who we are right now and what we're going to become in the future literally written in a code that we are shedding all over the place every single day, just inviting somebody to read those answers. And I consider it to be an enormous piece of good fortune for myself and everybody that we are the first cohort in all of history that has the opportunity to read that information and then use it proactively in health. In my clinical work, I spend most of my time dealing with the situations where the genome goes terribly wrong, but what I'm most interested in is understanding how, when the genome is working properly, what it's telling us about our health at the moment, and particularly about predicting the future of our health. 15 years ago, we started the first ever trial of using polygenic risk information, so complex risk assessment in breast cancer. At the time, it was the first real study to attempt to do that in clinical practice, and we learnt pretty quickly why it was the first study. Literally the second person that we offered a comprehensive risk report to wrote an extensive complaint letter to us talking about how they were unsettled by that information. They couldn't understand it. They weren't sure how we could possibly think that we could know what their risk was going into the future, and they really wished that they hadn't told us. A lot of what I've done in the 10, 15 years since then, along with all the technological advancements, massively increasing the genome-wide association studies that provide all that background data, but a lot of it has been answering those questions, looking at the patient experience, looking at communication, understanding the workforce that we need in order to try and use this type of information in clinical practice. And when we started the first national rollout of a randomised controlled trial of comprehensive genomic risk assessment in 2020, we didn't start with a fancy new genome-wide mass array, even though I'm happy to tell this audience I find that extremely exciting. What we started with was an education program for clinicians, and went around the country training and educating people to use this information as the vital first step to actually making it work and getting that kind of clinical utility. Working in genomics, I have the great good fortune of knowing that we're very literally, like the famous Isaac Newton quote, we really are just fiddling with the pebbles on the beach. There is so much more to come, and I'm looking forward very much to the kind of things that we can offer through genomics into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It really is interesting to hear little highlights of some of the challenges people have had, and yet how they've looked more beyond and reflected on issues here. Our next speaker is Professor Robert Newton from Edith Cowan University. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much. I really want to acknowledge how proud I am of this fellowship. It's really important to me. I also want to acknowledge my nominator, Professor Christabel Saunders. I truly want to thank my university, Edith Cowan University, for all the opportunities that they provided to me and my team. 21 years ago to actually really get behind exercise as a medicine and clinical exercise physiology, and it's greatly appreciated. So I deal in an exquisite medicine. This medicine is shown to be highly effective for treating all chronic diseases. It has no side effects. That medicine is exercise. Exercise is medicine. Principally, my research addresses the application of exercise medicine in the management of cancer, so exercise oncology. And we're looking right across the spectrum immediately post-diagnosis, where we're using it as a neoadjuvant treatment here. Some great examples there are preparation of the patient for surgery. We have a MRFF study currently funded where we're looking at patients with cancer of the pancreas. This is an exceptionally difficult disease with poor prognosis. We're using exercise highly targeted while these patients undergo neoadjuvant chemotherapy to actually get them to surgery. These patients are too unwell to undergo the surgical procedure, and so we're using exercise medicine to make them physically and psychologically resilient enough to undergo this major abdominal surgery. Exercise is also used in the adjuvant setting where it's used to facilitate the main therapy. We've done exceptional work here, particularly around men with prostate cancer, to overcome the side effects of androgen deprivation therapy. This is chemical castration, the removal of testosterone from the cells in the body, but it has, whilst enormous benefit in suppressing prostate cancer, it has devastating effects on the body, particularly on the musculoskeletal system, but also exacerbating cardiovascular risk and metabolic disease. We've shown for the first time worldwide that we could stop bone loss in these men. We also showed considerable suppression of the progress of cardiovascular and metabolic syndrome in these patients. Finally, I'm co-leading with Professor Fred Sard, a major international trial in men with advanced metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer. These men have very short lives, median survival around 33 months. It is a survival study to see if we can improve progression-free survival. So we're actually working with these men in our early data, not published, not out there, so this is all confidential, but we're actually showing a 4-month survival advantage in these men, which is considerable considering the median survival is only around 33 months currently. So it's an exciting area to be working in. I never thought that exercise medicine would actually be recognised. I never thought that I'd be standing up here to be a fellow of this very important academy on the pillar of work around exercise medicine. So thank you very much. I just want to finish off by thanking my wife and daughter for all their support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. And where indeed would any of us be without the support of our family and our friends? Okay. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Sharon Goldfeld from the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much. And it's like a science candy store here, isn't it? You know, just there's so many interesting things, and I think we combine between excitement and imposter syndrome. I also just want to say how grateful I am to be here, and I'm very excited to be part of the Academy. So I'm going to start with this supposition that no one else here other than me has sung at the Opera House.
Wrong.
Oh, I love it. I'll come back to that. If I don't come back to that, you can come up to me afterwards and ask how I got to sing at the Opera House. But let me just start with where I've come from as well. So I get to head up something called the Centre for Community Child Health, which sits across the Royal Children's Hospital and the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And we do everything from screening all the babies for hearing in Victoria, right through to clinical support for children with developmental behavioural problems, a really large research footprint, including the wonderful Harriet Hiscock here, who heads up our health services research, and then a big translation piece. And we've been really responsible for doing some things at impact in public health. And as part of that, one of the things we've done, and our mission is to try and make a real-life measurable difference to inequities in children's health and development within a generation. We've been able to show there's 3 times the difference when children start school on their development between the poorest and richest areas of Australia. And we haven't moved that for over a decade. And in fact, when kids track through school, inequities only get worse. Now, can you imagine a health intervention where we said, We'd like to give you something 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, 40 weeks a year for 13 years. We're not really sure if it's going to work at all, and in fact it probably doesn't work, and we're going to make inequities worse. You go, sure, we'll fund that health intervention, no problem. And that's what schools are. Schools are actually the most extraordinary exposure that children get in this country, and I would suggest that they're totally and utterly not fit for purpose and not doing what they're meant to do. And of course, they're the most powerful social determinant for children. We know that inequities get under the skin, we know that they lead to chronic disease, and we know that this generation of children, for the first time ever, are unlikely to exceed their parents. So, I'll come back to the education thing in a minute, but I just want to say that changing things and inequity within a generation is my story as well. I'm a first-generation child of Holocaust survivors who came here as poor immigrants. And I think that's an important story because I think it's the story you've heard today about how you can change inequities within a generation. So, how do you actually make a difference? Well, you've heard about what James was talking about, making a difference to many things, but schools are the one place where we can make a difference, and hence how I ended up at the Opera House with Pasi Sahlberg, who was a Finnish educator who used to head up the science area of the Gonski Institute, remember that? And he asked me to come on a panel, and it was the Opera House's birthday. And we sang Happy Birthday to the Opera House. And so on that note, thank you very much again. Thank you to all of you here for tolerating all of us up here. Thank you.
I always love hearing Sharon speak because she helps remind me why I'm also a paediatrician. The issues of equity in education are really fundamental to child health and to all of our health. My singing the Opera House was because I was at school, and our school, my school, Cheltenham Girls High School, if anybody knows, that was the very first school in the whole of Australia ever to hold a speech day in the Opera House just after it opened, with remarkably unmatching school uniforms for the concert hall. But we sang there, and I did that on two occasions, so it was fantastic. But yours is far more interesting. Okay, we come to the last, but certainly not the least of our speakers, Professor Stuart MacGregor from the Clan MacGregor, as we saw last night, who's from the QIMR Berghofer Medical Research Institute. Thank you, Stuart.
All right. It's great to be here. I'm delighted to be honoured by the Academy. I've been working for the last 25 years in statistical genetics, and so that's a field which looks to work out the relationship between genetics and disease risk. And as you can tell from my accent, or if not from my kilt last night, I'm originally from Scotland. And in certain circles, people from Scotland had a reputation for being tight-fisted or careful with money. And unfortunately, from my point of view, I didn't do anything to dispel that illusion because I spent the early years of my career trying to work out statistical and computational methods to do gene mapping as cheaply as possible. So it didn't help with the stereotype, but being efficient in how we did things in terms of statistical and computational methods turned out to be really key to some landmark discoveries that we made in the genetics of skin cancer, genetics of some eye diseases, those were the early stages of my career. We then moved to developing computational and statistical tools so other people can make sense of large-scale data sets, and so enabling others to perform their research. And then after our initial successes in gene mapping, we were able to work in a consortium science model, so work with clinicians and other scientists within Australia, but also internationally, so lead international efforts to do very large-scale gene mapping studies. That led to identification of hundreds of genes for a wide range of diseases that I work on. I particularly like to focus on so those genetic discoveries give new insights into biology, but also enable me to be a pioneer in genetic prediction. So that's a way of using a simple saliva test to predict a person's disease risk. And I'm particularly excited about genetic prediction where there are translational consequences. And so, for example, in the eye disease glaucoma, then if we get early diagnosis through a genetic test, we can have simple treatments to prevent blindness. And so academically, we're pursuing randomized controlled trials to really show whether there are benefits of genetic testing in glaucoma. Also, beyond that academic work, and recently we've been really pushing commercialization to get our genetic predictions into the hands of patients. And so I'm a co-founder of a startup, Sionix Bio, which is now returning genetic results to participants. We started our sales in Australia last year and this year in the US. And so that's been a great way for us to push our academic discoveries into actual use. I'll briefly just say at the end like many people here, I've published hundreds of papers, but I'll just draw attention to one aspect which has come up in a few of the talks today. Is I'm really proud of my mentoring record. I've got 6 recent mentees who have NHMSC investigator grants or other major fellowships, and so I'm keen to develop that in association with the Academy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Well, we ended as we started and as we continued with tremendous presentations. So thank you to all the speakers and the new fellows for their exceptional presentations and for rising to the challenge of being able to condense information down to 3 minutes. Our final panel session for the annual meeting will begin at 10:40 at the Higginbotham Hall, just around where we were yesterday. I look forward to seeing you all there. And now please join me in one last round of applause for our new fellows.